So you mentioned that David Schneider and Lloyd Fowler's and someone else came.
Clifford Geertz.
Clifford Geertz came and were meant to be doing Parsonian things, but instead they turned to culture.
They developed their own idiom, and it's quite remarkable that they didn't agree at all on it. It was called a cultural analysis. You know, like Cliff wrote this thing called religion as a cultural system.
Yeah.
David wrote cultural accounts of, say, things like American kinship and things like that. It was very, very good work, but the more important thing was that it was a change of emphasis entirely. It was as though the Americans, who since Ruth Benedict had been harping on this issue of culture as a sui generis phenomenon, as a phenomenon that did not need support from studies of kinship or social relationships or social order or history, but could be treated as an independent variable, more or less. That's what these people were trying to forefront. Cliff Geertz was only at Chicago until about 1970. He left for the Institute of Advanced Studies in Princeton, where he had a long and, I think, for him, very successful reign. He didn't produce all that much after a while, and a lot of anthropologists found his writing style problematic but intensely liberating in some ways. So we were talking about a fairly brief time at Chicago during the 1960s when the department turned itself around entirely, had a number of people I haven't mentioned here, such as, for instance, Julian Pitt Rivers. Now, he gave me what I could consider my most valuable course. I admired him. He was an upper-class Englishman who would explain to us in class the rules for upper-class Englishmen. You weren't supposed to be able to give a course in field methods, and yet he gave an astoundingly good one. He wore brilliant ties, which is one of the reasons I do this. I in emulation of him. And of course, he initiated the community studies thing with his wonderful book, People of the Sierra. I audited his course. I took it on a whim, and I didn't know at the time that I would be in Papua New Guinea. A few months later, I got my grant very suddenly and went. And I learned, I think, more that was useful from Julian Pitt Rivers in that course than the other things had to be rethought later. What kinship I learned from Fred Egan, what things I learned from David Schneider were in the end tremendously valuable. But what I learned from Julian Pitt Rivers was practical, immediate. I had otherwise no idea of what it was that anthropologists did when they got to the field. And of course, I had no idea either when I did get to the field, but pardon me, that was a valuable course. That was a fantastically good course. And I became, like my colleague George Mentor, just a total admirer of Pitt Rivers. We also loved the story that he ran off with the wife of the Spanish ambassador. This gives added zip, puts a little bit of Indiana Jones in there. This is charisma. You can really admire people like
that. When you talked about this cultural turn, as it's often called, and the way you put it, the shift from Ruth Benedict,
yes,
sort of reminded me of the title of one of your most famous books, The Invention of Culture. Was that somehow linked?
The Invention of Culture was written because I became increasingly angry and annoyed with the type of anthropology that was being done at Northwestern when I was there. And I don't mean Bohannon. Bohannon was a good guy. Bohannon was a guy on my side. The rest of it, I thought was sort of moribund, didn't come up to what they were doing at Chicago. David Schneider was a great admirer of the invention of culture. It was a thing that occurred to me at one point. It took me out of the anthropology I had studied before that. I mean it quite sincerely and seriously as against these so-called constructionists. You know, the postmodern people who are always saying that culture is a construction, referring back to Piaget or something like this whole French thing that came up in the low period of anthropology, this period of spoliation in the 80s, you know, when it bottomed out and the place was full of postmodernists.
So tell me the theme of the invention of culture, the argument.
The argument is that culture is first and foremost invented. It's invented out of whole cloth. It's invented out of nothing, if possible, when you need something like the idea of culture. That the invention of culture belongs to a really important and perhaps universal disposition of human beings to regard part of their area of activity as innate or inherent, or something that they can't change, and then part of it as that domain over which human beings are responsible or have responsibility. But the important thing is the overlap between these two, because in cultural phenomena, so-called, as we call them, human beings do, in fact, do a great many things that they're not supposed to do. They forecast the weather. They tell you what the universe is built like on uncertain evidence. They erode and counteract their own standards for these things. We have the autonomous nervous system, autonomic nervous system. We have the sympathetic nervous system. We have the parasympathetic nervous system. These systems are, they merge with one another. The area of the innate and the area of human responsibility merge with one another. But you've got to be specially qualified in order to do this. You and I have to be professionals. Who can say what this culture is about or that culture is about? You and I have a degree which gives us the authority for certain circumstances, and perhaps for general circumstances, to dictate to the public something we should not be able to say, which is how, they thought in Old England about things, how they think in New Guinea about things in specific places. What's going on here? I think the irony is that human beings really do command in certain ways everything. But they're very, very specious, invidious, strange about how they go about doing it. Human beings do all the things we are not supposed to do. And also the things we're supposed to do. And they do them in strangely contradictory, self-contradictory ways. They're very peculiar animals. So what the invention of culture means is that culture is invented in some way out of working between these two extremes. Like we, the human race, we are the parasympathetic nervous system of the universe. We work between these two. We merge them, we mediate them. I don't like the terms nature and culture, and perhaps this whole thing was invented out of some kind of need to avoid using terms nature and culture. They're a bit crude, I think. And so I prefer these things about the innate or inherent on one hand, and the realm of human responsibilities. We are not supposed to be able to augment or bring about the Eucharist, the partaking of the substance and of the Savior. This is not a thing that human beings ought to do, and indeed they can't. One has to be a priest. One has to be in a certain line of authority to be able to do this. We are also not supposed to be able to state what culture consists of, to describe culture, to describe its possible permutations or evolution or something like that. But then when someone is given a degree like yours or mine, then we are allowed, just as the priest is allowed to perform the Eucharist, we are allowed to officiate at some of these things, or at least debate what's going on. And you've got a very funny interface. You've got the invention of culture, not the construction of culture. Culture is not constructed. Reality is not constructed symbolically, as these people, these Piagetians, these people in France like to say. It's not construction, it's invention. That's the point, okay?
Just to get it absolutely clear, intrinsically, what is different between invention and construction? Construction is much more self-conscious, is it?
It's belabored. It looks like it belongs to this long period of economic domination and industrial domination that extended through the world wars and the labor movement and the whole economically determined 19th century and in post-Enlightenment European civilization, which, you know, it's the labor period. I'm not anti-labor. I'm not conservative. I'm not. I don't have a position in that. I'm just being critical of it. It's like these people who argue, I think this is called ethnomethodology, that human beings are inherently scientists, we have an inherent or innate methodology that informs our doing of things, that part of our mind is making little experiments all the time, you see. Who would take the trouble for that kind of crap? We don't work that way. We don't construct a lab. It would take you more time to construct, 5 minutes tomorrow morning than to live that 5 minutes tomorrow morning. So that the people who want to interface all sorts of procedures, even if they be heuristic, even if they pretend that they're neuronic things in our constitution that are doing this construction, that is crap. We invent, we do not construct. And so by this insight, by this assertion, I'm putting aside all of this torture stuff about, human beings as scientists, human beings as empiricists. They don't work that way. They do things very quickly, sometimes very brilliantly. Sometimes, I think people are creative beings. I think they have these great coups that they accomplish. But they accomplish them instantaneously. They don't work at them. If they would work at them, they would turn out to be worthless. You see what I mean? We're not that good. We can't construct culture. We can only invent it. That would be close to the rationale of that book. I'm afraid, however, that at the time I wrote the book, my prose was very turgid. And after about the second chapter of The Invention of Culture, it gets to be something of a chore to read it. And people don't. They read it by title only, which is fine with me. But when the book was taken up by the University of Chicago Press after its first edition with Prentice Hall, I begged Chicago for the right to rewrite certain of those chapters, which I thought even then had gotten to be a bit too tortuous. And they said, no, we have to make money too, and so we'll let you change only 2 pages. And so I picked the worst pages and I changed them. But yeah, this is what I mean by that. And I mean this very radically. It's the thing is also related to a thing that I call obviation, which I do with triangles. It's a procedure for studying myth. What I mean by obviation, well, the dictionary definition of obviation is to anticipate and dispose of. What I mean by that is that the career of symbols in our culture is that the symbol means, the symbol signifies, the symbol goes through its paces by, they call it deconstruction, I would just call it exhaustion or degeneration, that what you see is a series of symbols falling apart, disintegrating. that there's no such thing as a constructive assemblage of our culture by using symbols as though they were Legos, you see, and making buildings out of them and making cultural scenarios out of them. Now, what happens is that something's falling apart and we just think it's coming to, it's obviating, okay? This is an almost, I suppose, Heraclitan way of looking at things. I personally, I prefer Wittgenstein. I was told that Wittgenstein used to hang out around here.
I had a room where he used to, where the famous confrontation with Karl Popper took place, you know, Wittgenstein's poker and so on.
Yes.
And the Cambridge Philosophical Society. It was room H3, I'll show you it afterwards.
Yes, I'd like to see it. I teach the Tractatus in my cultural inventories course, and I teach that with Jorge Luis Borges' stories.
Okay.
I think that both Wittgenstein, with whom I have some disagreements, I think I would be mad not to disagree with him at certain points, but I really love him, and I love the spirit of things in his work. Okay, he was also a Rilke. He was also very fond of Rilke, which makes me. He said he thought Rilke was a bit conceited, but otherwise that he liked him. Pardon me. So I think of myself as a Wittgensteinian, and I do not like phenomenologists. I do not like Heidegger. I do not like Husserl. This whole slate of things that these people have tried to invoke in the desperate periods of the 1980s and 1990s and keep quoting as though they understood something, I think that's crap. I'm a Wittgensteinian. I don't think Wittgenstein would have suffered that kind of thing. Okay, he was a brilliant man. So anyway,
And you mentioned Borges.
Yes.
You're a fan of Borges.
Very much. And also Ursula Le Guin, the science fiction author.
Kroger's
daughter. I teach a course I use 2 of her books regularly in this course. The one I like best is The Left Hand of Darkness. Light is the left hand of darkness, and darkness the right hand of light. It's about a planet where people do not have permanent gender. It's a glaciated planet. And they have a religion called the Handara, which is based on ignorance rather than knowledge. And it's based on going into trance and merging with what is around you rather than thinking separate thoughts. And it's based on a thing called the foretelling, in which a group of adepts, including 2 schizophrenics, somebody going into sexual heat, and so on, they will give you the answer to any question, regardless of whether they know the specifics of that question or not, simply by knowing yes and no that well. It's sort of the ultimate dualism. So the protagonist in that novel, who is sent out to this planet, Guinea, he's sent out to this planet to bring it into the acumen of civilized worlds, of sentient worlds. They're all colonized by various types of human beings, okay? So he has this difficult and dangerous task of traveling on Gethin and bringing their very peculiar governments into line with this. And early on, he wants to know if his mission is going to succeed, because very often emissaries like him are simply killed. I mean, you know, take me to your leader, I'm from another planet, wham! You know, so he goes to a foretelling. He seeks out the foretellers, and he has them answer the question, will this planet Gethin be a member of the Ecumen in 5 years? And they go into trance, and it takes them days, and there's like hysterical laughter, and these people are... And finally he sees the weaver, the leader of the thing, as a woman in light with a sword, saying, yes, 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 yes. It's a very, very beautiful novel. I think it's the best. It's an anthropological science fiction novel. I think it's the best science fiction novel ever written.
I must read it. I've read some of her children's.
Yes, she's especially effective with children things. She's worthless as a poet. But that, you must read that, please, for me.
I will.
Okay?
I will. Yep.
It's that good. It is really that good. You'll love it.
I will. one thing I wanted to, well, just leading on from there, what you said about symbols.
Yes.
You like paradoxical titles, the invention of culture, and you wrote one with a paradoxical title or something like symbols that stand for themselves.
That's right. And then later in a book on, edited by my colleague Fred Damon and Mark Moscow, who's at the ANU, a book called On the Order of Chaos. It's a recent. I wrote the afterword, and it was entitled "Order is What Happens When Chaos Loses Its Temper." David Schneider liked those kinds of titles too, and I guess I learned that from him.
Tell me about, I mean, the definition of symbol is that it can't stand for itself, so how did you get around this paradox?
Well, symbols that loop back and do stand for themselves for a brief moment are the kind that obviate. In other words, yes, it's a little bit something like Kant's Ding an sich, or a thing in itself, you know, that referentiality is ultimately necessary for meaning or signification in any case, and a self-referencing thing obviously has no meaning. Yes, that's exactly when you. That's what happens when you complete the obviational loop. Or, all right, you have a thing that falls down, falls by itself, that degenerates, that goes out of being. It completes, you know, the Hegelian triadic dialectic, whereby you have the synthesis, the thing ends in synthesis. What I discovered was that Hegel really didn't go far enough with that. If you double the triangle back on itself and draw one inside of the other, you get a double synthesis that finishes the whole scheme. The problem with the Hegel thought he discovered the end of history. So did the Americans when the Eastern Bloc collapsed, but they actually discovered the beginning. The problem with the Hegelian dialectic, or even in a sense the Marxian dialectic, which of course Marx got by turning Hegel on his head, right? The problem with this is that Hegel said at the end of the synthesis you have an Aufhebung, what do we call that? Sublation, in which you achieve one of these Kantian enigmatic things in itself. That's the dialectic collapses into something like that. I wanted to put together something like a double dialectic, which would allow you not only to witness that type of collapse, but actually witness and experience the whole process reaching its necessary end, that nothing comes after assimilation. This is a deterioration, or, you know, like one of those birds that disappears up its own rear end kind of things that people used to talk about. And that this process of disintegration or meaning loss, or call it what you will, is the natural tendency of symbols, and that they all do that, and that they degenerate that way in time in almost a Spenglerian kind of way, where you have a culture basically disappearing. And I don't think that Spengler thought of it this way. I think Spengler thought of it as a kind of a ongoing cyclicity that after a while simply tires out, and then you have kind of a stale civilization there. I don't agree with that. I think that the symbolism of the civilization positively exhausts itself. And yes, you get things afterward, but that we have to face this not as a peculiar cyclical thing that just happens to civilizations, but as a necessary part of the symbolism in the civilization. I don't think that Spengler paid much attention to semiotics, to what happens to symbols. He was thinking in a Goethean or perhaps Nietzschean universe that has very little to do with what we do in anthropology. He might have liked this kind of stuff, like obviation, but of course he's not around to tell us about it either.
Gregory Bateson. We were
Yes,
talking
okay, fine.
You knew Gregory Bateson, did you?
Slightly. I engineered a meeting with him because I'd gotten very, very excited about his work when I was at Northwestern. And Bohannon was saying one day, he said, Roy, who should we give an honorary degree? And he said, that would be good because Bateson has some friends in the psychology department and we could bring him by here. And he did come, and so I had a chance to talk to him, and that was marvelous.
Mm. What sort of mind? He had a very original mind, didn't he?
Bateson had, it was a little bit like Vic Turner. He had one idea, and it was a magnificent idea. It was actually the driving idea of, as he put it once, scientific research and weaponry in World War II. It was the idea of the feedback loop. It was the idea of chiasmus, maybe kind of a chiasmatic thing like Lévi-Strauss gets into sometimes. And it was an idea of a kind of very supple oppositional scenario that he first identified among the Yatmal people on the Sepik. He called it schismogenesis, and he meant by that the generation of structure, the generation of eidos and ethos, intellectual and interactional realities, relationships, through a kind of a dialectic, a schismoid dialectic, or if you will, perhaps even a dialectic of schismus with schismus. He did articulate this beautifully in one of the appendices. I think it was the 1958 appendix, cybernetically to Novin, to his great book, Novin. I never got the sense that people understood it as directly as he had put it. And I always thought it would have been worth his while or someone's while to play with that a while until they could get it to a point where that would be more easily understandable. I also thought he might have made some mistakes with it. You have how does this go? You have a symmetrical schismogenesis, and you have one between two opposed things of the same kind, and then you have complementary one, which would be, say, a schismogenesis between mutually necessary roles, like mother and child or something like that. And symmetrical would be two clans or two nations. And Bateson used to oppose these, talking about, say, the World War or something, the various nations of Europe warring with one another vis-a-vis the social classes, all the same in the case of each nation, but warring complementarily within each nation, so that if you could motivate a world revolution or rising of the proletariat in all of these different nations, you would obviate or cancel out the national boundary differences, and then suddenly it would be a different kind of war, and it would be a rising of the proletariat. And basically what he said about the Yatmal people is that they kind of use these two principles vis-a-vis one another in they have warfare between symmetrical units, and they have these arbitrated tensions within the kinship systems between actually the mother's line and the father's line of any individual. So he saw the whole thing as being supported by the alternation of these two types of tension. Okay, now that's it's almost cybernetic. It's a lovely model. Bateson went on through his life to apply these kinds of models to many different things. To the etiology of schizophrenia, and he's written very well on that. What he called the double bind theory. You see, when you've got both of these tensions working simultaneously in someone, they have to take it another way out, and they go schizophrenic. They talk word salad. They don't communicate. They're trained that way. And he applied it to different things, the communication of dolphins, which he did so much toward the end of his life that I don't know very much about it. But when I was at Northwestern, one of our students became an absolute devotee of Bates and Haley type psychoanalysis or psychology. This student, who was, I think, particularly gifted, he was also quite a good friend of mine. He was actually the first person who forced me to read Castaneda. I didn't want to read it at that time. He made a career for himself working for something called the Family Institute in Chicago on white mother-son middle-class incest cases, of which he said there were a whole lot in Chicago. As a matter of fact, what John revealed to me was that there is a great deal of incest within the family going on in our societies now. And this is not spoken of because people are ashamed or they think it's not a topic to get in and discuss. He said that the cases that he was working with and treating had to do with mothers who wanted to protect their sons from all those dirty girls out there on the street.
And this is quite a widespread feature in Japan too.
Is that so?
Same sort of syndrome.
Yeah.
In fact, Japanese mothers feel it's part of their obligation as mothers to provide sexual services for their sons and to protect them.
They would. They would.
But I'm going to draw you now back to your fieldwork, if I may.
Yes.
Because we've moved on from Bates and a bit. So I noticed the pattern. I mean, the 7 books that are cited in one of the lists of your publications, I think 4 are fieldwork and 3 are theoretical.
Yes, that would be about right.
You talked a little bit about your first arrival in the field, but it would be very nice to take you back to that.
Yes.
And why you chose that area.
It was chosen for me.
What was important about the fieldwork? Okay.
It's a huge topic. It's hard to think about right now. Basically, the University of Washington, which at that time in Seattle, the University of Washington had sort of an open competition among graduate students in the United States. They had something called the New Guinea Native Religions Project. They were the only university with a viable, together New Guinea Studies program. And of course, work in the highlands in New Guinea, or I was not really in the highlands, was quite new, and it was a frontier. It was judged to be a frontier area. They had already sent several people out. I think Lou Langness was one of them, and had good results with this. I simply wrote them a letter. You had to write a letter, like a contest, saying what you would do, and I don't remember what I wrote, what you would do. What you would do if, vis-a-vis, collecting, doing something about religion, trying to understand the religion. And after a number of months, they had selected somebody else first, but he was not suitable for some reason. And so they opened the contest again. This is like name our soap or one of these American things. And I was sleeping late. It was May 7th. I was sleeping late in my room in International House, and I was having a dream. I had planned to work with Australian Aborigines if I did not win this contest and get to go to New Guinea. Sleeping in my room, it was sort of, the sun was up already, and I was sleeping. I had a dream that I was getting into an airliner, and it was understood this was going to Australia for my field work in Australia. Airliner took off, and in mid-flight, it turned into a single-engine Cessna, and I was sitting next to the pilot, and the pilot was making a landing approach at a grass airstrip with banana trees along the sides and blue mountains in the distance. And I got a shock, and I said, this is not Australia, this is New Guinea. At that, I woke up because my room was being buzzed. That was the telegram announcing my grant to go to New Guinea. About 4 or 5 months later, I was in that Cessna, landing at the strip with the banana. I saw the whole thing entire in advance. The interesting thing about that was that the people who sent me there didn't know they were going to send me there at that point. So it's very dramatic. I was very confused. I was totally bewildered. I'd never been to another country before in my life. I had sort of a bad start. I got sick. Trying to live on a native diet. I just ate too many sweet potatoes. I got sort of a terrible thing in my stomach, and a Czech researcher who was passing through sent me some medicine from Portland. It was very, very complicated. Eventually I got set in. And I would say that in my life in the village, that about a year and a few months that I lived there that first time, that was the nicest time of my life. It was extraordinary. I had no conveniences. Wonderful rapport with these folks. In Darabee are known as extremely friendly people. They'd only been contacted or pacified for between 2 and 3 years at that point. You couldn't get anything out of them. They wouldn't tell you anything. But, it was kind of nice living with them and getting to know them and stuff like that. I mean, it was a totally remarkable experience. I never guessed that you could have an experience like that. And it was like rebirth, because you see, my mother died. She passed away just before I left. And so I needed to get away. It was, I don't know, like a totally amazing miraculous thing. It's really hard to...
I know the feeling. How many times have you been?
Well, not too many times. After my initial field work, and after I wrote my dissertation at Chicago, I got a job at Southern Illinois for only a few years, and I met a woman there who I married, and then she came with me back for another, I suppose, 10 or 11 months at Karamui. That was a much better time because I knew what to ask then. The Darabee had this ritual that I just missed attending the first time, the habu, which turned out to be extremely important, and I was able to not only attend it, photograph it, but participated in it the second time, and that actually was the experience that set up my second book, Habu, so much better than my dissertation. That was a good book. One of the few anthropological monographs that has been used as a basis for a science fiction story by Larry Niven and James Barnes. The book is called Dream Park. It's about the Darabee. It's acknowledgedly about my monograph. Not a terribly good science fiction story, but Larry Niven is one of my favorite authors, so it made me happy.
And then you went, subsequently, have you been, or?
Yes, I returned in the year 2000 to Karamui. A lot of things happened, Ellen. While I was there the second time, I got word that the colonial government, which was about to leave New Guinea, had secretly been buying up a lot of land. To resettle 5,000 Chimbus at Karamui. Chimbus are very aggressive people, and they had, really sort of manipulated the Darabee in the past. And so I took political action. I wrote kind of an expose about ethnocide in an Australian political journal. That amounted to very little other than the Governor General or whoever it was having press conferences against me in Port Moresby. It was not to my... It was not advisable to go back at that point. They probably would have shot me, actually. But a correspondent named Ian Hicks from the Sydney Morning Herald picked it up. And this was at a time when Australia had a Labour government. And Hicks wrote an expose on the government's attempt the Australian Parliament or government informed the colonial government that there would be no resettlement at Karamui. So, we won. We won. For once, we won. And since then, the independent government has been very resistant to the idea. A Darabee politician picked this up and kind of campaigned in their parliament for it after this. So and after that, between that early time and the year 2000, the Darabee increased in population fourfold. So there are now 20,000 of them. So it's very, proof against this kind of incursion, I think. I feel very proud of that. That's the reason why I did not go back to Karamui for a long time. But when I did go back, it was very wonderful. I also discovered things that I would never have guessed existed there when I went back. It was a totally successful operation.
The other thing that, one of the other things I wanted to ask you about was you went there to study religion, as you said, and
yes.
We were discussing heaven and God earlier.
Yes.
Where to start on God, but anything you'd like to say about God and
Sure. I was
have a cup of tea if you like.
My father was sort of a second generation American, and his parents had come from the old country. They were Marxists. They were vindictive Marxists, like a lot of immigrants from Eastern Europe. They look at America, they see it as a shallow place, they see it as a place where people are cheated out of things a great deal, and so their Marxism comes to the fore. So my father was a very hard-working, very Americanist. He was reacting against his parents as well, you see, person, and very atheistic, very rationalist, extremely rationalist guy, okay? And that would have been enough to trigger some sort of religion, I suppose, off in me, but it didn't. I identified with this. So I didn't even begin to think about serious things in religion until much later in my life. And the work of Carlos Castaneda, which, say what you will about it, has some...
So it wasn't, it's been highly criticized, isn't it?
Yes. And rightly so. Castaneda was a wretched human being. He was not a very nice person at all. I've gotten some, I think, good evidence recently that he really did do field work with the Mexican people, and it was significant. But they were not the Yaqui, they were the Huichol. And that the Huichol even named Castaneda's informant was a man named Juan Matzewa. And the Huichol are probably capable of a whole lot more epistemological and spiritual profundity than the Yaqui. Yaqui anyway, the Yaqui aren't great that way. But no, the core, some of Castaneda's books, like his third and fourth book, are incredible. They are probably linked to things that were going on in the Mesoamerican civilizations. And in some ways they beggar Western philosophical thinking. I say that advisedly. Okay? It's really cool stuff. I've just been working for years trying to explain that, to bring that out. Clearly, it's my most successful course. There are now thousands of people who have gone through my Castaneda course. Okay. Many of them better than I am. Okay? So it's a big thing with it. God, all right, I came into this thing when I was writing this book called An Anthropology of the Subject, with the notion of bats. In many ways, there's a lot of stuff to be said about bats, and in some way I got some very good insights by a Scottish anthropologist named McKnight.
David.
Yes. That stuff was superb. He worked with the Wicmuncan on bats. Well, the Darabee are on the other side of those bats' migration routes. So they fly over the Arafura Sea and they come up the main rivers of New Guinea, like the Purari. And they're all pregnant females when they come up the males have scattered, and all you see are these immense flocks of pregnant females at Karamui. And the Darabi have no end of anthropomorphism that they visit on these bats. They say they build dwellings for themselves, and that may possibly be true, but I've never seen one. The original students of these fruit bats, some biologists from Harvard, found only sort of parturient females in flocks and concluded that these were creatures that did not have males. They were originating creatures. Someone then added that Carl Linnaeus had classified bats as primates. I'm told this is almost certainly true by the DNA, that they are primates, not insectivores, whatever that means. Yeah. Well, the Darby say that bats, fruit bats, are exactly what human beings would be if they did not have gender. The Darby story about them is about some woman who created male genitalia for her husband, and she came from the place where these bats originate. I mean, where they stop their migration flight and give birth. And so that, from the Darby standpoint, human beings are fruit bats that are gendered. All right. The Wicmunkan on the other side of the spectrum, they see the male part of it. And they see the bats as basic to their initiation of their youth in making them male, like the decisive male element. So the original article I wrote on this is called What is Male in Australia, Female in New Guinea, and Frequently Hangs by Its Toes. Anyway, this led to a whole lot of interesting conclusions about bats and human beings being inside-out versions of one another. That bats bounce their voices off of things to navigate, and we do the inverse. We bounce our voices off of our innards to create words. Okay. So you've got like two opposite types of being, both primates, kind of a dialectic that way. God comes into the picture because God is actually like a bat at a cocktail party. You have to imagine them, it says in the book, I guess it's him, you have to imagine this bat god that's holding a martini and standing there listening. And there's this conversation going on, and people are talking about things. And the bat will come and acutely listen. In fact, listen even better than Jack Goody. Like, really listen. The bat is there with this martini listening, right? You have to imagine him human-sized. Now, he's not listening to the drift of what you're saying. He doesn't give a damn about that. He's listening for himself, which is all that the bats ever do. They listen for themselves when they're bouncing their voice off of rocks and trees and things like that. So the bat, and what this god bat is listening for is it's trying to, by echolocation, gauge what it is. Because God, having created the universe and being more or less one with its creation, its problem is it cannot separate itself from the universe. Yes, it is all the things we've said. It is omnipotent, it is omniscient, perhaps omniscient in everything but one thing, that it cannot know itself from other things. So it's listening to what we say about it or about everything else for itself, to somehow demarcate itself against all the information that's out there, okay? It wants to be a god. It's not yet a god. God can only be a god when God is distinct enough from other things that it's not just another pantheistic invention. You see? I mean, this is almost a Heraclitan idea. It's this Heraclitan thing, we live the gods' deaths and they live ours. Right? It's sort of like that. So that's the kind of God I believe in. I mean, and I really do believe in it. It's like this character Q in Star Trek The Next Generation. Q comes from the Q continuum. He is, to all intents and purposes, omniscient and omnipotent, and likes to play silly games with the Enterprise crew, right? Played by an extraordinarily good actor named John Delancey. The question arises of why Q should want to be a member of the Enterprise crew or bother these people or do anything like that. And the answer is that he has these incredible powers. He can literally do anything he wants, but he can't appreciate his powers. And if you have those powers and can't appreciate them, you might just as well not have them. So he likes to dazzle the Enterprise crew and do crazy things to them, just to get oohs and ahs so he can feel better about himself. And he was sort of the origin of my Bat God hypothesis about the universe. It's probably different than this, Alan, you see. It's probably, this is just another one of my ethnographically inspired ideas, theologies and things like that. It's probably more Borgesian, and it's probably that, yes, you will die someday. We will all die someday, of course. We will meet God. Various peculiar things will take place that we don't understand at all, and we'll be left there. We will not be dead. We will not be alive. We'll just be left there somewhat bored, wondering what the hell just happened to us. I once wrote a sonnet about the dead, and the sonnet said in the end, they never wonder where the living go. Okay.
That's nice. Several things you said, like the Castaneda and also the dream you had about landing in New Guinea, and something you were talking about, the kind gift you gave me, which led to a spell of strange luck.
Yes, that was odd.
Do you, if you connect all these things on a thread, I've been interviewing a lot of astronomers and cosmologists about parallel worlds and parallel dimensions. And it's quite clear that the kind of simple beliefs that many people have in religion are much less far-fetched than the ideas in the 11th dimension or parallel universes. Does it seem to you that in fact what you've experienced both as an anthropologist and in other ways suggests that that there are, as they say famously in the cliche from Shakespeare, there are many more things than in our philosophy?
Well, I can reply to you very simply, and this is based on one of the lectures, one of the lectures in the Castaneda course. I could also give that lecture to you though, if you like. At the basis of our duality, there are two selves. There are two parts of ourself. There is the anticipatory self and the recollective self. The recollective self is all you call a mind or a memory. It is entirely recollective. It's incapable of acting. It only thinks it's acting. It doesn't act. It goes backwards in time. It recollects, as Don Juan says. That's the part that we think with and remember with. The anticipatory self is always gone by the time you think of it. It's there and gone. It throws itself blindly into a space it never sees. That part of us has been with us since we were born, both parts. They just develop, the recollective part develops since birth because it gets more to recollect. The other part is the part of you that was never born and will never die. It's impervious to any of the orders that the recollective self can think up. It just doesn't belong to them. It's not in the same ballpark. One of these parts of the self claims the whole of us for itself. So that the recollective part, by thinking and thinking about itself thinking, and thinking that it's acting without even acting at all. The other part, by acting as though it were thinking, but only acting, but being perfectly accurate like a ballet dancer, always coming down where it needs to come down, even though there's no earthly reason for it to do so. But then reasons don't belong in its domain, so it just keeps, each one of them thinks it is you, and the anticipatory self is the one that dreams. It walks in your dreams at night. And the recollective one is the one that, mine is talking to yours right now, okay? It likes to boast about things, it likes to plan nice things like walks and whatever, but it never does them, it just talks about them and thinks about them. Now, the totality of these things is called the totality of the self by no one. If you can engineer it in such a way, sometime in your life, perhaps later in your life, perhaps by the end of your life, that you can claim the totality of the self, these two parts of you will be so much a part of each other that they will be indistinguishable from one another. And when that happens, if death does happen to you, you won't notice it. You'll still be alive. In fact, death makes no difference in that case. Now, I have no certainty that that kind of state can be achieved. I'm rather certain that Carlos Castaneda never achieved it. But that's what these people are dealing with. That's what they're talking about. Don Juan would guarantee that when we die, there's a part of us that will live on, and was always here, and was here before we were born. You don't remember it, because the memory is part of the recollective self, which has to do with our incarnation at this particular point. That's how the Castanedans would look at that particular detail. Okay? It doesn't at that point matter whether this stuff was made up by Carlos Castaneda or was made up by some Huichol named Matsewa or some Yaqui named Don Juan or by Heraclitus. It's an interesting way of thinking about things, okay? That's all, see?
I think at that point, shall we end there?
Yes, let's do that.
And thank you very much indeed.
My pleasure.